Well, I'm happy to be here again. This is getting to be a habit on Thursday evenings. I don't know what I'll do next Thursday. Anyway, today I want to begin by telling you about an extraordinary English woman whose name was Lucy M.J. Garnett. And in the 1880s, as part of the general Victorian interest in exotic cultures of the non-European world, she set out to travel throughout the Ottoman Empire for nearly a decade. She was a woman with some training in ethnography, and she was able to observe in ways that a man would not have been able to do the behaviors of the women of the East, is what she called them. That is, these were women in the Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities of Turkey, Syria, Bulgaria, Lebanon, Palestine, and even parts of Greece. And she actually wrote it up and published her observations in 2 volumes in 1890 and 1891. And later I'll mention some of her observations. But her books had the effect, at least in Victorian England, of making those women of the East visible. Whether the data she provided, as another traveler of the period noted, without the data she provided, as another traveler of the period noted, quote, the female sex may be said not to have existed at all. They were so kind of hidden. Well, the situation is not so dire when it comes to investigating another group of women of the East, that is the women of ancient Israel. They are at least partly visible in the Old Testament, but their religious lives, I think they're every bit as hidden to outside observers as were the daily lives of women who lived in the Ottoman Empire. Now I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. Okay. I'm going to begin with a little background on scholarship on women and religion in ancient Israel. And by ancient Israel, I'm talking about the end of the 2nd millennium and the beginning of the 1st millennium BC, from about 1200 to 587. That specific 587 date is the date the Babylonians conquered the kingdom of Judah and burned down Jerusalem for all, destroyed the temple. So ancient Israel exists for those centuries, the first half, the end of the 2nd millennium BC and the first half of the 1st millennium BC. And when I'm talking about ancient Israel, then I'm talking about a time well before Judaism, which doesn't emerge into the late centuries BC. Ancient Israel did not have what Judaism had. It had no Torah. It was not completely monotheistic. So it was a precursor of Judaism, but it should not be equated with Judaism. Now, the beginnings of modern biblical scholarship in the 19th century actually showed some interest in the role of women in religion. Not long after Lucy Garnett's books appeared, there were some biblical scholars, and they were all men at that time. They entered into a lively debate about the role of women in biblical religion. And amazingly, in 1898, there was an article in the Journal of Biblical Literature, which is still the premier journal in the field of academic biblical scholarship. This article actually asserted that women's participation in religion in ancient Israel was broader and more significant than was commonly supposed. Well, what he wrote was an exception. Virtually everyone else had the opposite view. For example, in 1897, a man named Julius Wellhausen, who is arguably the most influential biblical scholar of the last 2 centuries, he claimed that women had no political rights and no place in religion. Well, anyway, whether viewed positively by just a few of those guys or negatively by virtually everyone else, at least they were thinking about women in the biblical period and religion. But that interest faded as the 20th century began. For most of the 20th century, biblical scholarship virtually ignored women. Israelite Women, their role in Israelite religion, they had become as hidden as those women in the towns of the Ottoman Empire. Now, that situation has again changed by the late 20th and early 21st centuries, where I probably wouldn't be sitting here. By the late 20th century, influenced by the growing second wave feminist movement in the United States, Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and elsewhere, there has been a resurgence of interest in the topic. And new scholarship has revisited, reconsidered, revised, and revamped existing notions of the religion of Israelite women. But to tell you the truth, virtually all of this new scholarship has been very critical, viewing women as secondary actors in Israelite religion. And I think that's wrong. Although women's religion is no longer ignored, in my view, this recent scholarship has failed to understand, one, the part that religion played in the lives of Israelite women, and two, just as important, the role that women played in the religious lives of their families and their communities. Now, why is this? Why have contemporary feminist approaches largely failed to understand or even see women's religious culture? Well, I think there are a couple reasons. The first problem is that current approaches have tended to view men's experiences as the norm. They identify men's religious roles, which are visible in the Bible, and then they look to see whether women could do what men did. For example, if men were priests, which they were, and women weren't, then men must have had the most important roles. Women's roles thus are considered less important. Just by definition, they're marginalized, not considered real religion. I'll soon be challenging that. Another problem is the fact that most of our information comes from what I guess we should say is a biased source, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Its authors, priests, prophets, sages, they were mostly urban male elites. They were interested in national, communal events and practices, the Jerusalem temple, the wilderness tabernacle, not in family or household religion. So they just don't tell us very much about household religion. The national perspective of the text fails to provide information about religious activities that would have been part of daily life in the small towns and villages and the farms in which most people lived, far from Jerusalem and other national shrines. So the virtual invisibility of household religion in the Bible makes us think that either those kinds of activities were non-existent or unimportant. And the third problem is that the study of religion, whether it's the religion of men or of women, the study of religion tends to focus on the study of what people believed or what gods they worshiped, rather than what they did. What I want to emphasize is that religion is activity as well as belief. In the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, that great big authoritative work, as late as the 1971 edition, the definition of religion in that work had actions and rites, not system of faith, as the first definition of religion. Religion in the past would have been familiar to the writers of the OED. Religion of the Iron Age of the Israelites was belief in a deity or deities and other powers, including both benevolent and evil spirits, you'll hear about them, but also appropriate responses to those powers, activities, actions, rites, rituals. The emphasis in the world today on belief, at least in part, I think is the result of Christian and especially Protestant emphasis on belief and faith, rather more so than activities and rituals. It would have been foreign to people in biblical times. Religious activities of the ancient Israelites were surely shaped by their beliefs, but religion was what people did as much as what they believed. And what they did was likely to leave traces in the archaeological record. So the term religious culture in the title of our session today. It's not religion, it's religious culture. It acknowledges the material aspects of traditional religion and indicates that archaeology might be valuable in trying to recover women's religious practices. And we have a multidisciplinary approach, as we had last week. We'll look at 3 kinds of data: archaeology, because of the essential materiality of what people did and is religious practice. We'll draw information from texts, including the Bible and other ancient Near Eastern texts if they're available. And again, ethnography will be useful because analogies from observable cultures can with care be used to understand ancient ones. And also behaviors recorded by people like Lucy Garnett will be of considerable use. Now, you've seen this before. Where did religious activities take place? In the family household. As I mentioned already, the household was the most numerous unit of society, and these are 3 possible reconstructions of what the actual dwelling would have looked like. And as I've said before, Israelites were mostly farmers, even if they lived in walled settlements. And there may have been some itinerant traders and even some markets in the larger towns, but most farm families were self-sufficient, kind of like the pioneer families of this country. The household was the primary social, economic, and now I'm going to add religious unit. Think of it this way. For most people, Jerusalem and the temple were really far away, like a 3 donkeys day drive, too far for any regular journey. Maybe once in a lifetime, people went there as a pilgrimage, but for the most part, they would never have seen the temple in Jerusalem. Now, of course, there probably were regional shrines and high places for communal ritual events, if we take seriously the dozens of biblical texts that condemn some of those high places. But archaeologically speaking, many of the places where religious rituals took place were the houses in which people lived. Sometimes there was a special corner set aside for rituals, but household rituals could and likely were performed anywhere in domestic space, including courtyards or roofs. And I'll give you one example of worship on roofs a little bit later. As I understand it, there are 4 important aspects of women's religious culture: and reproductive rituals, food or meal rituals, rituals to help people who are sick or injured, and then the festivals and life cycle events. So we'll begin with reproductive rituals. For farm families, having children was critically important. There were no schools. Children were essential for the household workforce, and they were also needed, we have to keep reminding ourselves this, as caregivers for elderly parents if those parents survived. There were no retirement communities or assisted living facilities in ancient Israel. But reproduction, fraught with problems, as the barren matriarch theme in Genesis indicates. Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel all have difficulty conceiving. Infertility, I'm sure many of you know, is a common problem even today. The CDC estimates that 1 in 8 or 10 children of childbearing age in the US have trouble conceiving. And the stats are a lot worse in developing countries. It could be as many as 1 in 4 have difficulty. And the situation in ancient Israel would have resembled that of developing countries. Similarly, miscarriages would have been more common than they are today. It's estimated that about 15 to 25% of recognized pregnancies end in a miscarriage, and it would have been a lot higher in the biblical world. In addition, maternal and infant mortality rates were high, as they are in the developing world today. You know that Rachel is probably the best known biblical example of a woman dying in pregnancy or childbirth, and the first son of Bathsheba is probably the best known biblical example of infant mortality. There's been a lot of work done on skeletal remains, and the results tell us that as many as 1 in 2 children died before the age of 5. And this isn't just ancient Israel. This is pretty much anywhere in the ancient world as it is in the developing world today. In Northeast Afghanistan today, for example, infant mortality rate is as high as 60%. So it's no wonder that the eschatological hope of biblical prophecy, the hope for better days at the end of time, is expressed as a time when there will be no more infant mortality. Isaiah 65 verse 20 reads that at the end of time, and in the new age, in the future age of eternal and everlasting peace, no more at that time shall there be an infant that lives but a few days. Now, lactation was today in the United States, we're hearing a lot about this in the news lately, as you know, but in the United States, it's been estimated that about 50% of women can't physically lactate. And of course, there are lots of other reasons that women don't nurse their babies. But that percentage is higher in developing countries, where poor nutrition can mean that as many as half of new mothers provide inadequate milk. So all these problems that I've listed can be dealt with to a certain extent with medical care, although prayer is certainly also part of the process of trying to resolve them. In antiquity, religious practices were the main recourse. Reproductive problems were attributed to evil spirits. And Israelite women, like women in traditional societies everywhere, developed a variety of practices that were intended to ward off all those evil spirits. And some of those practices have left traces in the archaeological record and survived even into relatively recent times. Now I'm going to show you some of these objects that were used to protect women in pregnancy or childbirth. And we call these apotropaic or protective objects. They are designed to avert evil, and they are regularly found in Israelite households. Of course, lamps can be used for light in dark places. Knives can be used for processing food or for battle. Rattles are musical instruments, that's on the lower left there, or possibly as children's toys. And beads, well, most archaeological publications call them items of personal adornment. But all of these objects, in addition to these everyday usages, were also considered apotropaic, protective. And we know that from biblical allusions, from other ancient texts of neighboring peoples, and from ethnography. So let's look first at lamps. As in many cultures, light was considered a powerful protective agent in ancient Israel. For people believed that there were demons. Demons are mentioned in the Old Testament, and demons don't like to be in light. A number of biblical passages equate darkness with danger and light with protection. For example, in Psalm 91, the psalmist refers to, quote, the terror of the night, darkness, and the pestilence that stalks in darkness. In Job, in his final discourse, recalls his former happy life, saying, in the days when God watched over me, when God's lamp shone over my head, thus equating light with divine protection. And I have to say that the Proverbs 31, which we all heard at the beginning of our time together today, I don't know if you caught it, but it mentions this amazing woman that her lamp is on all night. Now, I used to think that meant she was pulling an all-nighter, working all night, but now I suspect that means that she kept the lamp burning all night because it was protective. It protected her family from the evil spirits that lurked in the darkness. Maybe it's a little bit like the night lights we sometimes leave on in children's rooms because they're afraid of those monsters who lurk at night. Metal blades, knives, strange as it may seem, these sharp metal weapons were considered apotropaic. Jewish women in 19th century Bulgaria, Palestine, Syria, and Afghanistan, they kept knife blades with them for protection from evil demons right after childbirth. Moroccan men brandished knives outside a birthing room to keep Lilith, and Lilith is a demon in the kind of mythic background of the ancient Near East, a demon who preys on babies. We also have, and you're going to see him a couple times, we have this Egyptian dwarf god named Bes, B-E-S, and he had a really ugly face, and that was thought to scare away any evil spirits lurking around the birthing chamber. So he's often depicted waving a knife. As I said, more about him in a few minutes. Now those rattles, terracotta rattles made out of clay like the ones you see here are called spool rattles because of their characteristic shape. They're about 4 inches long, 2 or 3 inches in diameter. In ancient Egypt, that dwarf god Bes, whom I just mentioned, would scare away any evil spirits lurking around the birthing chamber, not only by waving a knife, but by dancing, shouting, and shaking a rattle. Noise is a common anti-demonic tradition. Like light, it was used to keep the demon Lilith away from preying on babies. Now, jewelry, like lamps, shiny jewelry reflects light and thus keeps demons away. Mesopotamian and Egyptian texts mention that jewelry protected new mothers or their babies from evil spirits. Middle Eastern women of more recent times wore silver-threaded amulets or fastened tiny silver or gold bands on the caps of infants. Why? To reflect light and protect themselves and their babies. And speaking of jewelry, there are a couple kinds of amulets found in Israelite households that were specifically meant to provide protection from evil forces, the ones that were interfering with reproduction. Here we come back to Bes again. These amulets depict this Egyptian dwarf god because, as I said, he was a protective deity believed to frighten away evil demons, especially those threatening women in childbirth and newborn children. Many Bes images have been found in Egypt, often in monumental sculpture. And here you see my husband and I with a Bes statue. We were fortunate to go to Egypt to visit some archaeological sites right before the pandemic. The Bes images in the land of the Bible are small objects, notably amulets. These drawings are a sample of the amulet scarabs and seals depicting Bes that come from Israelite sites. They've been found often enough to suggest that this Egyptian dwarf god was popular as a protective figure throughout ancient Israel in the Iron Age and even later. I think that the most important image on this slide is the one I've got circled, 225E. This is a mold for making Bes amulets, and it was one of several that was found in Israelite sites. Now, what does that mean? That these Bes amulets are not imports from Egypt. They were locally made, attesting to Bes's popularity among Israelite women. Now, were these women worshiping Bes when they used these amulets? I really don't think so. They were probably appropriating a powerful apotropaic symbol that could help protect them and their children. And historians of religion have shown that certain visual symbols can migrate across cultures and lose their original theological meaning in the process. And that idea that powerful images can migrate is true for another image, the Eye of Horus. Like Bes, this image originates in Egypt. It's an Egyptian symbol for protection from evil, but it's also found in households at Israelite sites, usually as amulets or eye beads. These images were thought to be protective to keep away the evil eye or evil spirits that could harm pregnant women, women in childbirth, or infants. Keeping the evil eye has been part of folk culture in the Middle East from antiquity to this very day in Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities. As our 19th century ethnographer Lucy Garnett noted, the evil eye is as much dreaded by Jews as by Christians and Muslims of the East, and their charms and antidotes against it partake for the most part of similar character. Eye images are still available on keychains, pendants, jewelry, beads, t-shirts, and so on that you can buy on the internet. And it even appears on the reverse of the $1 bill, where it is interpreted as the eye of God watching over our country. Using dollar bills or wearing Horus-eye jewelry hardly means that we worship Horus. I would add that some of these practices are alive and well. Just a few years ago, an article in the New York Times quoted a Middle Eastern woman concerned about her inability to conceive and some other medical issues as saying that she wore amulets because amulets are good and sometimes doctors don't help. Doesn't hurt to try at least to have the amulets too. There are several other apotropaic practices worth mentioning, although they don't show up in the archaeological record, but they do in the textual and ethnographic record. One of those is the presence of red thread or cloth. Red is widely considered anti-demonic in the ancient world and again, anti-evil eye. Texts from ancient Anatolia and Mesopotamia tell us that red threads were thought to protect moms and babies. In medieval times, Jewish and Christian children often wore red or coral strands to protect them from evil forces. 19th century ethnography tells us that Turkish Muslim women protected themselves and their babies by wearing red kerchiefs in childbirth and putting red caps on their newborns. And thus it's highly likely that the red thread tied around Zerach's hand in Genesis 38 marked the infant as the firstborn and also served to protect him. Now, this magico-medical aspect of red appears also in ancient customs associated with the traditional tomb of Rachel near Bethlehem. To this very day, or at least until the political situation made it almost impossible to do this, very religious Jewish women who were pregnant or hoped to become pregnant would travel to Rachel's tomb in Bethlehem, near Bethlehem, and wind a red thread around the tomb 7 times. 7 is a sacred Semitic number, and then tie it around their wrists. And they believed this would help barren women become pregnant and protect pregnant women during pregnancy and childbirth. Rachel, who suffered for years of infertility, but then did have 2 children, and then died in childbirth. She's kind of the patron saint of women with reproductive issues. And I have to tell you that a number of years ago, I went to visit a woman, an elderly Jewish woman in the community whose husband had just died. And she showed me a little pouch with a red thread in it that her husband's mother had someone bring her back from Bethlehem when she'd had trouble conceiving. And she conceived, and this man whose funeral I was going to, he was the product of the red thread around Rachel's tomb. In any case, if you can't get to Rachel's tomb, you can even order a red string, which has been properly wound around the tomb. Amazon Prime, it costs $19.95, and Judaic.com, it's on sale for $9. Another non-archaeological example has to do with taking care of newborns, and we read in Ezekiel 16 in a really horrific metaphor that compares Jerusalem to an abandoned infant who is not cared for at birth. And we find out that there was no one there to perform what were 4 standard procedures. On the day you were born, your navel cord was not cut, nor were you washed with water to cleanse you, nor rubbed with salt, nor wrapped in cloths. Well, salt was widely regarded as anti-demonic and was rubbed on babies in ancient Israel, according to this passage in the prophet Ezekiel. And it was also carried out in parts of Europe and the Middle East well into the 20th century, and even in some places in the 21st century. This was a religious act meant to protect the newborn. Now, we might call all these practices magic or superstition, but they were the ancient equivalent of today's preventative or restorative medicine. We have to think of them as strategies to intervene with supernatural forces that were believed to impact the well-being of mothers and their offspring. These practices were understood to be religious in nature, involving invoking and involving divine protective power. The ubiquity, the abundance of these practices in the Middle East and all over the world make it inconceivable that women in any pre-modern society, ancient Israel included, would lack such religious practices to deal with the life-death aspects of reproduction. These kind of practices perhaps gave them some sense of control and mental ease as they confronted the dangers of reproduction. At least I'd like to think that it did. These apotropaic artifacts and actions were hardly secondary to belief. Now let's turn briefly to food rituals, which we've kind of already talked about last week. The preparation and consumption of food, of course, are basic human activities, and bread especially is an essential part of ritual behaviors among peoples everywhere to this day, like the wafer of communion or the challah of Jewish Sabbath and festivals. As I said last week and the week before, bread was the staple of the Israelite diet, a high-carb diet with as much as 75% of a person's daily needs met by grains. Grinding grain to produce flour, preparing dough, baking it, those were women's tasks, and rituals associated with bread baking were women's rituals. Bread was literally the staff of life, and both texts and ethnography provide evidence of bread rituals. Making bread was a religious as well as an economic activity. Numbers 15 and Ezekiel 44 refer to a special donation of dough called trumah, so that households would be blessed. Numbers says that when you eat of the bread of the land, you shall present a gift to the Lord from your first batch of dough every time you break bread. In other words, you'll pull off a piece as an offering, as a gift to God. And Ezekiel kind of reiterates that and says that when you do that, that will bring a blessing on your house. Ethnographic reports tell us much the same thing from observations of the 19th, 20th, and even 21st centuries. All sorts of precautions were taken in traditional societies to make sure evil spirits did not enter the containers in which flour was kept or in which bread dough was mixed. For example, some Muslim and Christian peasant women to this day allay their fears of tainted flour. These are women in the Middle East, which was believed to be caused by evil spirits. And they would say special prayers when they brought flour to the mixing bowl and recite certain phrases as they prepared dough. And as I said last week, bread was considered sacred, literally the staff of life. And people would pick up a piece of bread if it fell to the ground and kiss it. It was considered providence from God and deemed holy. So Israelite women pitching off a piece of dough for their God were carrying out a ritual associated with preparing a sacred substance, bread. Also, offerings of bread and other foodstuffs were arguably part of daily meals, according to evidence, for example, from an 8th century BC dwelling at a site called Tel Khalif, not too far from Beersheba. In the back room, which is labeled 5 on this drawing, a group of food consumption vessels, not cooking vessels, like these 2 bowls, were found together with several cultic objects, including this bevel-edged stone that is probably a presentation altar. At least that's what the scholarly experts suggest. An altar on which symbolic pieces of bread or other foods prepared by women were placed as offerings to the ancestors. More about that in a minute. Rituals that are no longer visible to us would mark any meal as having ritual components. And household meals prepared by women were no less religious than sacrificial meals at shrines. Both ethnographic and textual evidence indicate that everyday meals in Israelite household had ritual components. Ethnography shows that household meal rituals are ubiquitous in traditional cultures, especially when bread is the most important food. And we have several passages in Jeremiah referring to women preparing a special kind of bread and libations in their homes, not at shrines, and offering them on the roof, actually, to assure household prosperity. We have similar information in ancient Near Eastern texts, and Deuteronomy 26 forbids offering food for the dead, which, of course, in so doing, indicates that small bits of food probably were being offered to ancestors, as other Semitic peoples did. All these rituals would mark any meal as religious. Household meals prepared by women were no less religious than sacrificial meals at shrines. What we might consider mundane acts of preparing and consuming food were religious activities for the Israelites. We turn briefly now to a third area of women's religious culture, treating illness and injury, which happens to be related to women's role in food preparation. Keep in mind that just as reproductive problems were attributed to divine malevolent forces, so too were illnesses and injuries. And like dealing with reproductive problems, treating maladies was a religious activity. Various herbs and medicinal plants, many of which were the same ones used for food preparation, like garlic and coriander mentioned in the Bible, were also used in folk medicine in the Levant until quite recently, like to treat infection and aid digestion. And the mortars and pestles that are recovered in women's food processing areas of dwellings attest to the fact that women were using them to prepare herbs, to compound medicines that were hoped to be used as salves or as treatments for indigestion or other ailments. Ethnography certainly shows that women are traditionally the healers in the household. And the Bible also refers to women as herbalists and healers. The prophet Samuel mentions in talking about the drawbacks of a monarchy, says that you don't want a monarchy because the king will take your young women to be cooks and bakers and herbalists. Most translations say perfumers, but I think they're incorrect. In 2 Kings, as I mentioned last week, when the Shunammite woman's son is ill, it's his mother who is supposed to help him recover, which she does by bringing in a prophet. Most striking, I think, is the maternal imagery for God in Hosea 11, where God is depicted as a mother. And what does a mother do according to these verses in Hosea? God holds, feeds, and heals God's children, the Israelites. Healthcare was a woman's religious activity. Treating injuries would have been accompanied, by the way, with prayers and incantations, and we don't have those unless maybe some of the Psalms represent them. And the fourth thing, festivals, life cycle events. The arduous daily life of the Israelites was periodically relieved by festivals, regular festivals. There were harvest and planting festivals. There were the monthly new moon festivals and the weekly Sabbath. And then there were all those occasional life cycle events, you know, marriages and funerals. The anthropologists have pointed out the inherent sacral dimension of women's work in preparing the food for all these festivals, as well as for daily fare. This sacral dimension of preparing food for festivals is called diffuse religiosity. We may not think of maybe we should, of food preparation for holidays as explicitly religious, but in traditional societies, it contributed to women's overall experience of taking part in sacral events. Now, to sum up, as I said at the beginning, the activities I've just described took place in the household, the primary social, economic, and religious unit of ancient Israel, virtually all pre-modern farming communities. In this setting, women were ritual experts. Their ritual practices dealt with the supernatural to tend to the ill or injured and to facilitate the celebration of religious festivals. Many of their rituals dealt with life and death matters, like successful reproduction, having safe food to eat, and were considered essential for the welfare of families. Religious practices performed by women in Israelite households were therefore just as important as the formal religious activities performed by priests at community shrines or temples. Yeah, women were religious experts for their households, just as priests were for the communities. Men were hardly the sole actors or even the lead actors in the religious culture of the Israelites. For in household life, women were arguably the lead actors, virtually hidden to us in that role if we look only at the Bible. And in that respect, I want to mention Lucy Garnett once more. You remember, she's the one who wrote about the women of the East, making them visible. When she finished her manuscript, she sent it, as she should have, to her editor. It was already accepted in London, a man named John Stuart Glennie. He really liked her work, and he wrote a preface to the book, and he acknowledged that in many aspects of household life, quote, supremacy was accorded to the women, not in the least because of their important role in reproduction and sustenance. His point is well taken, I believe. Once the otherwise hidden culture of women in the Ottoman Empire became visible, we could see the importance of women's activities and appreciate them. And I think the same is true for the otherwise hard to see religious culture of Israelite women. Once we see it, we can acknowledge its importance and significance for household life. So with that, I will stop sharing and see whether I can answer any questions you might have. Can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. So those who want to ask a question, please use your little reaction button at the bottom and raise your hand, or if you can't find that, you can physically raise it and I will find you. So while people are getting ready, I have a question for you, Carol. So what about in the ancient world when women were pregnant and didn't want to be pregnant? Were there also rituals for that?
Whether there were rituals for that, I don't know. There are some kind of indirect mentions of it in the Bible, but listen, it was so hard to have children who lived, and children were so essential to household life. You didn't have enough bodies in the household. You couldn't do all the work that you needed to do to produce food. Right. So I suspect, you're thinking about abortions, I guess. I suspect that they would have been few and far between. Now, how they might have tried to do that, we can only guess. It probably was not unheard of, but it was probably not. It was so hard to get pregnant in the first place. It was so hard to safely deliver a child that it's hard to imagine that the kind of culture that we have today, where we want to be able to choose, and if we don't want to have a baby, if it's inconvenient, if it doesn't fit with our jobs and so on, we want to be able to do something about it. I don't think that we can project that kind of mindset back into the biblical world.
What about exposure of infants? That didn't,
I've heard talk about that. I've tried to follow up on it and see if people say that, what kind of evidence they have, and I've come up empty-handed on that. I'm not saying that it didn't exist.
That's interesting.
One can imagine traumatic situations where maybe a woman committed adultery and she got pregnant and her husband had been away and it couldn't have been him, and she might have wanted to finally end the pregnancy. One can imagine those kind of scenarios, but we have, at least not that I know of, we don't have any textual or archaeological evidence that would give us any way to figure out how that would have been carried out.
Okay, great. Rita, you have a question.
Okay, sorry about that. Hi, Carol. So good to see you again. Thank you. This was really illuminating. And I'd like to go back to your reference to the red strings and chords. And I'm a big fan of the Rahab story with Joshua, where his spies told her to put a red cord down the side of the house, I believe. Is that a stretch to think that the red there is connected to this protection, or is it just, a coincidence?
Listen, as I said, red is was seen as being something that would keep evil away. So I think it's possible to at least suggest that red was going to protect the activities of these spies who were endangered by entering a Canaanite city.
And
great story.
Yeah, it is a great story. And then, God comes and finds her, or sends some emissary, I think later when she's in the camp, to thank her, or to, for her good work. The other thing I wanted to know, in terms of the artifacts that have been discovered, and you may have covered this, I missed it. I think in the Exodus story with Pua and Shifra, they mention a birthing stone, I think.
Yeah.
Have you seen them, or have they been found?
Birthing stool is the way it's usually.
Stools.
Yeah. Right. It's a controversial word, the word that's translated that. Some people think it refers to the fact that when a woman was giving birth, she would lie back with her feet propped up, which would facilitate delivery. Some people think that it had some other purpose. So I would say the verdict is out on what it actually was. But certainly there were midwives is one of the oldest professions in the world, and we don't have them from ancient Israel, but from her neighbors on either side, Mesopotamia and Egypt, we have long texts that talk about what midwives do and what they prepared and the kind of salves they use and the kind of medicines or scents and chants that they should do. So it was a well-developed profession. Now, whether it would meet the standards of midwives today, that's a whole other story.
Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you. Grace, you have a question.
In the explanation, Carol, that you've been given about the bread, the importance of bread, the sacredness of bread, the wine, how much sense it makes that Jesus chose the bread and the wine to say, I am the bread of life, and when you drink from this cup. And I was wondering if anybody else had the experience I had growing up. Bread was always considered very sacred in my home. Every meal we had a candle lit to remind us of the unseen presence of Christ at our table. There was no argument at the table. Afterwards, when parents were having coffee, then anybody had any problems, that's when it was discussed. But my mother, when she baked bread, she always made the sign of the cross on it before she sliced it. We never threw bread in the trash. My mother would either make croutons or breadcrumbs or throw it out for the birds, but never in the trash because it was holy bread.
Exactly.
And I was wondering if anybody else had those same experiences growing up. It brought back a lot of beautiful memories to me. Thank you.
Well, that resonates exactly with some of the anecdotes that I've been reading about customs in Middle Eastern countries. But do you grow up in the United States?
Carol, you're just a little bit far away again.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, there.
My mother's parents came from Poland and my dad's from Germany, but yeah, I was born in the States.
So it certainly was certainly something they brought with them from the old country.
Exactly.
Which brings up another point. What happened to the pieces of bread that they would leave on the altar? What happened to that? Do we know? Have any idea?
No, I would love to know. I mean, what?
Yeah.
I remember thinking that when I was in Japan and there were these little altars, in front of people's houses. What happened to that for offerings to the ancestors? What actually happened to what they put there? I never found out.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, great. So we have Sister Carolyn. You have a question.
Yes, I was wondering, what about in times of like incest and rape? Did the women, what did they have to help them during, after rape or incest?
Oh boy, we know that it was completely frowned upon. There are long verses in the book of Leviticus about the illegitimate relationships about who someone cannot sleep with, like what kind of relatives is it considered incest. And scholars are really divided about how to understand that. Are these kind of relationships spelled out because these were problems that were happening, or was this just a kind of primary sense of this would not be good for the psychology and the biology of the family to have these kind of incestuous relationships? But you probably know better than I do. I don't think there's a country in the world, a culture in the world, where there aren't prohibitions of incest, which of course probably means that there isn't a country in the world where it doesn't happen. What the punishments could have been really terrible for if people were caught doing this. But there aren't any narratives that really tell us whether or how it was carried out. Rape, again, does appear, and probably the worst example is the story of Dinah in Genesis, who falls in love with a non-Israelite man from Shechem, and it ends very badly for everybody. Let me just put it that way.
Because I was thinking, like even today, very often the women, was shunned or whatever, or the men all were taking revenge, on and were killing the other guy, but it didn't necessarily, they didn't necessarily feel good for the woman either. Very often she was shunned and it was like all her fault, because she was flirting or whatever.
Blame the victim. Blame the
That's
victim.
right. That's right. So I didn't know if you had known anything
No,
else.
there's one passage, it's not exactly rape, but I think it's a really interesting passage. It's in the book of Numbers, I think chapter 5. And it's about a woman who's accused of adultery. And it mentions that she's accused any number of times. And it becomes a kind of a he said, she said thing. She says she didn't sleep with this other guy, and her husband says that she did. So what do you do when there's this standoff? You can't bring her to trial because there are no witnesses, and you need at least you need 2 witnesses to convict somebody, according to the biblical legal passages. So this was probably happened in a lot of cases in ancient Israel, that you bring someone to the priest decide. And this is a little bit like, you've probably heard of a trial by ordeal. That is, it's like the woman, if she's telling the truth and she jumps in the river, she swims. Or in some cultures, she sinks. I don't know which is worse. They had these in the Salem witch trials. They had these kind of trials by ordeal. Well, they had them in the ancient world. And there's one of them in Numbers 5. So they bring her and her accusing husband to the priest, and the priest mixes up some sort of potion, which she drinks. And then one of 2 things will happen. Either she miscarries, in which case then there's no baby and she goes home, or she has a baby and she's then ostracized. It's something like that. But she's not put to death either way, which is really interesting because there are other places where the death penalty is specified for adultery. So biblical materials are not of one voice, at least Old Testament materials about this. And David commits adultery and he certainly gets away with it.
Right. Thank you.
Of course, he's the king, so really.
Thanks, Sister Carolyn. Anne, you have a question.
They always talk about they knew Jesus by the breaking of the bread. And sometimes I half wonder if he was using the feminine bread blessing motions or words as he did that.
Well, I am not a New Testament scholar, so I can't say yes or no about that, but I think that's an intriguing thought, and I'll actually look into it myself.
Thanks, Anne. And Joan, you have a question?
Yes, I'm French Canadian from Canada, of course. And we also were educated not to throw away bread and that bread was sacred, etc. So to this day, and I'm in my 80s, I don't throw bread away in the garbage. Secondly, I lived in Israel for a long time and was a guide, and we walked all over, and with students a lot. And we walked through the villages in around Hebron, and we visited lots of villages where they had olive oil presses. You didn't mention olive oil. It was the olive oil press was huge, so it was run by donkeys or men or whatever. But the use of olive oil was that very prevalent. I know today they wash their hair with olive oil and they use it for cooking and salads and everything, and even swallowing it when they're sick. So is there anything in ancient times that would that you can say about olive oil?
Absolutely. I think the things that you described probably go back to antiquity. In the Old Testament, this is mentioned numerous times. There's the great three of the Israelite agricultural economy: grapes, oil, and grain. So oil was a staple, and sometimes a meal would be nothing more than some bread dipped in oil. Olive oil was essential in everyday life. It was cooking oil. It was probably mixed with herbs to use as salves. Perhaps it was used for cleaning. I know that after I had my first baby, my hair was all dry and falling out, and I went to the person who cuts my hair, and she said, rub it with olive oil, and it helped a lot. So yeah, it was one of the three pillars of the ancient Israelite economy, along with grain and grapes or wine.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for the lovely also telling us about what you have done. Thanks, Joan. Okay, so we have one more. Janet, if you can ask your question, and then we're already over time. So let's.
Yes. Was there any religious significance to the menstrual cycle?
Religious significance, I just can't answer that. There's no text that tells us that, except the fact that men and women were not supposed to have sexual relations during that period. It was a flow, it was a discharge. And in the kind of anthropology of the Iron Age, and it was just not Israel, it was all the peoples of the ancient world, these flows, whether it was nocturnal emissions, semen, or menstrual blood, had some sort of magical significance. And when a person, a man or a woman, was having these emissions, they were considered, it's often translated unclean, but that's just wrong. It's impure, that they were in a state of temporary impurity and therefore would not be allowed to go up on the Temple Mount. Now, if you happen to live, 200 kilometers from the temple, I don't know how it would affect your daily life, but this was a different state of being when these bodily emissions were coming out, and there was some significance to it, which we have a really hard time grasping.
Thank you.
Okay, so again, thank you so much, Carol. This was just so fascinating. I just holding on to every single thing that I learned. So I'm going to turn it back over to Russ, and he's going to take us through a prayer and say good night to everybody.